Hey everybody, welcome to the first live chat of the new year. Thanks so much for joining me. I know it's been a minute since we've had our live chats, but with all the holidays and the New Year's, I thought it was great to take a couple weeks off and then come back strong. So if you are joining me live, I'm super excited because this is going to be like a virtual trunk show. Well, kind of like a mini virtual trunk show. One thing I miss about traveling now that we have this pandemic and I'm not going to guilds as much as I used to, I really miss doing the trunk shows because it's really fun to hold up my quilts and kind of talk about, why I made that or the process behind it and to answer questions. And so when I was trying to come up with topics for the live chat, I thought, let's do a little mini trunk show. But let me tell you, it is so difficult trying to pick just a few quilts to show you. Like, there's so many quilts that I have, so many pictures, so many quilts I don't have pictures of. It was kind of a fun little walk down memory lane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a little slideshow and I'm going to talk through each quilt. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. But since it's just me, I'm going to kind of be flipping back and forth. I'll try to see if I can't catch them. But if I don't catch your question and don't get a chance to answer it, you can still leave it in the comments after we're done, and I'll be glad to come back and answer it then. Because I know that some quilts, you might have questions specific about the quilts. And then at the end, I'll tell you about this week's giveaway, and then we'll talk about next week's chat. So let's go right into our slideshow. So first, every trunk show that I do, every little show and tell I do always includes this quilt. And this is a quilt of my husband's grandpa. So if you know my story, my husband's grandpa is the one that taught me how to quilt. And it's a very deep story, right? That's a joke because the reason I started quilting wasn't for any deep reason. It was just because I thought it looked like fun. And grandpa, when I met my husband or was dating him, his grandpa and grandma had already been making quilts. So when I would come around, I thought it looked kind of neat. And I was like, maybe this is something I would like. So he's really pivotal in teaching me how to piece. And he also kind of talked my husband into buying me my first long arm. So it's kind of fun that somebody who hand quilted, I would hand quilt with him, is the person that really started my machine quilting journey. After he passed away, I made this little quilt. It's only about this big, and it kind of goes around with me and keeps me out of trouble. I like to have him watch over me. So Grandpa Ford is the reason that I'm here, and I really do miss him. But that's what I think is so great about quilting, is that we can all invest our time and life into other quilters and watch them grow through it. So speaking of that very first quilt, here it is right here. Isn't it glorious? This was the very first quilt I made. I made it for Jeremy, my now husband. And Grandpa always loved this style of quilt. Very Amish style, so just a basic 9-patch, great quilt to start out with. And then the little stars with the sashing. And this quilt is still on my bed today. So I've been quilting for 20 years-ish, and so it's still in there. Love it. All right, but moving on, like I said, Grandpa talked my husband into getting me a long arm. And so that really started my machine quilting journey, and I loved that even more than piecing. And I'm including this picture as a example that every master was once a disaster. So as I start showing you some of my quilts, I don't want them to be intimidating or discouraging. I want them to be, inspiring and encouraging. But this is one of the very first quilts that I machine quilted with my long arm back 18 years ago when I got it. So how do you love that heart pantograph? Isn't it just gorgeous? I must have been so proud of this picture because I took another picture of the back of the quilt. So this was one of my first forays into machine quilting. And I think what's fun about it is, your styles definitely change as you learn a new craft. You definitely find more, you have your little phases and your refinement of your style. So this was my heart phase when I was pantograph quilting. So I loved that I came across that because it's so fun to be able to show you, we all start somewhere. All right, but let's get to the fun quilts. From that quilt with the heart to this quilt, this is the very first quilt I did for Tula. There was several years in between these two. So it's not like I quilted some hearts and then boom, went right to this. So you have to know that there was a lot of trial and error, a lot of crying, a lot of that stuff. So, but eventually I felt comfortable with it and loved it. And just so happens that I met Tula Pink, who lives only about 45 minutes north of me. And so this was the very first quilt I did for her, course, fabric designer extraordinaire, really fun gal. And this is the quilt that she gave me. So here I am, have this quilt from Tula Pink. I'm super excited, and I'm thinking, I'm gonna do something that I've never done before. Okay, that's not really a good way to go about it, just in case you're wondering. Just jumping right off the deep end sometimes can be scary, but I thought I'm gonna try Trapunto. Okay, so if you don't know what Trapunto is, it's basically where in some areas of the quilt you have 2 layers of batting where it gives it a puff. So in between those circles there's some detail, and I think I have it on the next picture. You can see it just a little bit better. So very labor intensive because there's quilting and then cutting and then more quilting. But I didn't consider the fact that to remove the water soluble thread that is part of Trapunto, I would have to get the quilt wet. So here I am with Tula's quilt. I'm freaking out a little bit because I really want to impress her. I want to quilt for her, and I have to tell her or have to ask her, hey, is it okay if I get your quilt wet? I can't really explain why, but it's going to be okay. Thankfully, she was fine with it, and it turned out great. But whew, that was probably one of the scariest moments ever for me, because I thought if anything bleeds on this quilt, if anything happens to this quilt, and it's a big quilt. So I ended up doing it in my bathtub to get it wet because I didn't want to wash it. Well, that means I have to clean my bathtub and clean the whole bathroom and threaten anybody from going in there while it's soaking. So kind of a fun memory. Obviously she loved it. Obviously it worked out because I've quilted so many quilts for her. In fact, a lot of the quilts you're going to see today are for Tula. And I thought, well, I could just call it the virtual quilt show of quilting Tula's quilts. But I did throw a couple other ones in there. But quilting for her has always been really fun, and a lot of different things that she lets me get away with, including getting her quilt wet. So this is her Cartwheels quilt pattern. And for the ones I do know the names, I'll try to throw that out there because I know that's usually a question that some people have. It's the Cartwheels quilt pattern featuring her plume fabric collection. So a lot of fun. I still look at that picture and I still feel that the nervousness that I had back then. So it's kind of fun to see that. I will also note that's the first and only time I've ever done Trapunto. Once was definitely enough for me. So pretty funny there. All right, another favorite quilt actually isn't a quilt, but it is for Tula. This is one of her Parisville panels. So Parisville was a fabric collection she had, I think it was just after Plume, but for her booth at Quilt Market, she wanted these 2 panels quilted to kind of show the theme of the booth. And so this is what she gave me, and it was super exciting because look at all that solid. I mean, oh, so great, but also super scary because, she wanted to be realistic and thread painted. And again, another instance of being a little scared. But at least here I didn't have the freak out of we're messing up a quilt. I mean, I'm sure I could get another panel if I needed to. But the result was really, really fun. And I don't have a really good flat picture of all of it, but I have some chunks to show you. It was so much fun to quilt because I could just play with textures and designs and, really have a good time with it. And so even quilting the name of the fabric collection into the quilt was a lot of fun. This is really the first time that I started experimenting with, switching up designs or, combining them or making the feathers kind of come out from behind the name. This wasn't anything that I had seen before, and I was just trying to think, what can I do that would be unexpected and different for these quilts? Then, of course, adding some detail. So here is the back of the quilt, using that thread to kind of add the hair detail and the sail detail. So lots and lots and lots of quilting, but still really fun. And so when I got to go to Quilt Market and see those hanging up in her booth, that was a lot of fun. So more detailed pictures of that. This really shows my machine quilting motto, quilt it to death and then throw some more quilting on it. If you don't like how it's looking, just keep adding lines over it and eventually it's going to look fine or just look filled in. So another really favorite quilt of mine. Another Tula Pink quilt. I know, I told you there'd be a lot of those. This is so fun because the story behind this quilt is it's made out of her prints that were rejected from fabric collections. So they're strike-offs or prints that didn't make the cut. And so it spells out reject. And I'm thinking at this time, who else is going to give me a quilt that says reject? I mean, this is just perfect. But what I really loved about it was the shading on the sides, those block letters. And so I wanted to make the quilting really highlight that. And so using the straight lines and different densities and using echoing. Again, it was just a real fun way to show that off. And then having fun quilting all the different designs. There was a great question somebody asked about meandering and how do you build off of what you already know, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but this is the perfect way. Combining designs is a great way to practice a few designs without committing to doing it over the whole quilt. So here I was kind of playing with some feathers and some paisley feathers, and then throwing in some pebbles. So it may look really thought out, but it's not. It's just kind of enjoying and throwing it all together. Okay, so speaking of throwing designs all together, this is actually not a quilt either. It kind of is. It's a whole cloth. This was quilted by me for one of my first fabric collections, early fabric collections called Drawn. Now, what I love about this quilt and what this quilt reminds me of is that you really should try new things, right? Try things that you've never heard of before and really kind of stretch yourself, because that's where we kind of grow as creatives. So I was teaching at a show, and one of the handy quilter educators in the room mentioned that you could run 2 threads through the same needle. And I'm thinking, like, what does that even mean? And she says, well, have you ever wondered why you have 2 thread masts on the back of your handy quilter long arm? And I'm like, well, now that you mention it, I do wonder why that is. And that's for this technique. Now, what's fun about using 2 threads through the same needle is it's going to give you a thicker line of quilting. And as the thread shifts, as it twists and turns, you're going to get different shading. So it's not quite like variegated thread in that I'm going to get a repetitive color change. It's just going to be more of a subtle shift. So the colors I'm using here are very similar. So in the center, I have the Drawn word quilted out. That was the name of the collection. And so in the outline, I would use 2 darker shades of red, and then towards the center of the letter, I'd use 2 lighter shades of red. So not drastic details or drastic differences, but just enough where it gave me a really pretty texture. Then around the word, I quilted those paisley feathers and those swirls. We can see that I'm definitely solidly in the middle of my feather phase right here, which I'm probably still, if I'm being honest, in that phase. I do love me some feathers. But it's going to give me that beautiful different change. So I kind of have a picture here. It's a little closer. You can't really see the thread change, but in those greenish yellow paisley or those feathers, what I've done is used a variegated thread. It was an Aurifil green yellow variegated, and then I also combined it with a medium yellow solid. So sometimes it would be variegated, sometimes it would look more muted, and it just gave it that really pretty texture. So you could see the green there, and then right next to it, that yellow, those are 2 shades of yellow, a darker and then like a medium, again, just to give me that thicker line and that pretty shading. And so what I did is went darker and lighter as we went in on the quilt. I think I have another picture here. Perfect. So you can see in the upper right corner, it's really light, and then it gets a little darker, and then it goes into that green. So now here's the thing about this technique. I wanted to try it because obviously I hadn't heard of it. I hadn't got the memo. And then once I did hear about it, I thought, well, I'm gonna give this a shot. Was there a chance that it didn't work out? Of course. I could have done that and it would have looked bad. Here's the difference. I just wouldn't be showing it to you right now, but I would have learned what doesn't work. So don't be afraid to try new techniques or try new things. If it doesn't work, well, at least you know that and you can move on to a different one. But this is a really, really fun technique, more for art quilting. This is not something I would do, over a detailed quilt or a quilt top, mostly for art quilting and shading. So a lot of fun there. All right, how about another tulip quilt? What I love about the things that she gives me is there's always a story behind them, and there's always some kind of inspiration or a direction to head. So if you've seen my Help How Do I Quilt It, I think I did a live chat on that a couple months ago, and it was this quilt, but it was so good I had to include it again. So imagine this. She brings me this quilt top, and this has been probably 7 or 8 years ago. It's been a while. And she hands it to me, and I'm like, that's really cool. Nice. And I'm thinking, I don't know what to do with this. And she said, well, it's a spaceship. I'm like, well, obviously it's a spaceship. No, she said it's supposed to be like a spaceship or like this ball hurling through space. And I thought, okay, I can get behind that. And so I had fun quilting different details in the background. So keeping it pretty simple in the patchwork. But what does every spaceship need? Every spaceship needs jet packs or boosters, like the little flames at the bottom, but it also needs somebody driving or flying the spaceship. I mean, this is obviously before self-flying spaceships. So if you look on the side, there's an orange triangle. It's like solid, like 3 orange triangles, and there's a middle one. There's a little alien guy just poking out there, and there's a little ladder, and that's how he gets in and out of his spaceship. So I am so easily amused, it's kind of embarrassing, but I had so much fun quilting a little space guy. I'm like, ooh, this little space guy's name, I probably gave him a name, we'll just call him Marvin, and making up little stories. So the fact that I could do that on her quilts is a lot of fun and gives me the freedom to really kind of push myself and come up with wacky things. I always like to see what's the next wacky thing I can come up with. And then there's those jet packs at the bottom. Those are the things that, or the rockets or whatever, that's what propels it. So sometimes quilting can be serious and it can be really, show worthy, and sometimes it can just be fun and whimsical. And I think if you can just have fun with it, you're gonna enjoy it. So definitely a good one. This one is Ventana by Allison Glass, and Allison Glass is also a fabric designer, really sweet gal, love her. And so when I would quilt for her, she would send me some of these quilts, and what I loved about this, besides the fabric and the beautiful colors, was that it's the same basic shape in between the blocks as the blocks themselves. So a lot of repetition. The problem about this quilt is there's not big area to put in huge feathers or really ornate designs. And so sometimes I'm facing these constraints by the pattern or these limits. And so I decided to, instead of trying to put big designs in it, I thought I would try to connect lines and create a secondary design. And so that's ultimately what happened with here, and I was so happy with how it turned out. I never know when I start if it's gonna look the way it does in my head. I have an idea, but when it turns out even better than I had in my head, I love it when it happens like that. And so in this particular quilt, using the lines in the background to create these kind of tiles behind the blocks. And the funny part is it was really easy because I could just use those reference points on the quilt and not have to do any marking or anything like that. Now, I did have to keep track of what went where. That did take a little bit of working out, but for the most part, getting that secondary design out was just really fun. And the most important thing here is scale, or contrast between the sides of the designs. All that area that isn't swirls or the outline is just back and forth lines, matchstick quilting. So that took forever, but what it does is it squishes down that background and lets the other stuff kind of come up to the foreground. So using that contrast to show off that secondary design, and then keeping it simple in the fabrics. When I'm looking at a quilt, especially if the fabric is the most important thing, I don't want to do anything over the top in the prints because I really want to let those shine. So I've done a couple of these quilts for her and other people. It's just a beautiful pattern, and this is one of my favorite ways of quilting it. All right, so this one was actually pieced by me, and it's actually the cover of a book I'll show you here in a second, this week's giveaway, and it's called Impracticality. Now, what's funny about this quilt is it looks unlike anything I've ever pieced since or before that. It's just kind of a one-time thing that this happened, and at that moment, I was really burnt out creatively. I was burnt out either way. And sometimes, when you work in a creative business, it can be easy to, get discouraged or burn out or just feel like you don't have any good ideas. And so I thought, I need to make a quilt. I hadn't made one in a while. I'd done a lot of machine quilting, but not making any quilts. So this one actually starts in the center, and it's improvisationally pieced in circles, and round and round and round it goes. And so I called it Impracticality because it's a hugely impractical use of time and fabric, but it was just a lot of fun to kind of put it together. To me, it looks like kind of like a tornado with the pieces, whirring out and coming out from there. That's probably because I live in Missouri, so maybe that's just, I have tornadoes on my mind. And what's fun about it is if you look in the middle, those pieces are really tiny, and then as we get out to the outside, I'm like, I'm so over this quilt. I'm done piecing it. I want to be done with it. So the pieces get much, much bigger. But then, you finish the quilt top, and there's that whole like, oh my gosh, how am I going to quilt it? So again, just kind of going with that tornado, that swirling kind of idea, and then in all those little pieces, adding little details. So I had a lot of fun quilting this. I probably, honestly, would not have finished it, because, if it's my own quilt, it usually doesn't get finished, except I had been asked to put it or submit it to a magazine. The magazine had called. So I'm really glad they did, because I probably wouldn't have finished it, and I'm glad that it's done. And it's one of my favorite quilts. And a funny story about this particular quilt is that it was hanging in the shop, or in the window of my quilt shop when we first opened, and somebody came in and asked if they could purchase it. And I said, no, we don't actually sell quilts, we sell stuff to make quilts, which is very confusing to people that aren't quilters. And so they said, no, I have to have it, I'll pay anything. I'm like, you can't afford it. They said, I'll pay anything. I said, $10,000. They said, I can't afford that. Well, that's good, because I want to keep it. But this will show you some of the up-close detail of the quilting. So definitely love this quilt. Never made one like it since. It's just what I feel like it's just all my creativity coming back, or all the burnt out parts going out. So it's just a good memory of that particular time. All right, hope everybody's tracking all right. This quilt was for my very first fabric collection called Textures, and it hung up at Quilt Market in my booth. And so very special to my heart, because I had thought, I want to learn how to design fabric. And so I tried to learn, and it took a long time. It was quite the process. But then finally got picked up, finally started designing it and built that skill. And so it's kind of a fun culmination of years of trying to get that going. I also love this quilt because it's a perfect example that you don't have to do difficult stuff over the whole quilt. So this particular pattern is from my second book in the studio with Angela Walters, and it's just fusible. It's just strips fused on and then quilted. So really easy. It's not even pieced, it's just fused on. But in the background corners, in the gray, I have all this detail, this dense combined quilting, but then in the blue, I have those wavy lines. Well, when I'm actually doing this in a guild, I'll hold it up and I'll pause, dramatically, and I'll say, why do you think I have two different designs in each side? And then I would make a joke like, oh, it's like the juxtaposition. I love the wavy next to the dense, but that's not it. It's quicker. Quilting those wavy lines is a lot quicker than all that dense quilting in the gray. So I try to do one difficult thing somewhere in the quilt and then do something easier over the rest, right? So this particular example, the wavy lines for me were much easier to quilt than that dense filler. And I think I have a picture, another up-close picture, and then of that dense quilting. So if you're sitting down at your quilt and you're thinking, what do I quilt? Don't feel like you have to do difficult stuff over the whole quilt. That's definitely not any fun. You want to make it easy on yourself. So have fun in some places and then take it easy in the rest. All right, so this quilt, I don't have great pictures of it. I wish I did. I probably could just get some next time I'm at Tula's house. But this is her anchor quilt, and I have quilted probably 4 different anchor quilts for her, and then some for Julie Herman. So this particular one, I think, was for her Zuma collection, if I remember correctly. This one I wanted to do a little different. So in the past, when I've done the anchor quilts, I've had this wraparound rope and, all this kind of stuff. This one I wanted to change it up. And so I started thinking, what can I do that's a little different? And really had fun playing with very common designs in maybe different arrangements. And so here, adding bits of crosshatch in between those swirls and those bubbles just creates a texture that made me so happy. Now, this might be a little shocking because I don't do a lot of crosshatch. I mean, if you look at a lot of my quilts, you rarely see crosshatch on it because crosshatch is very particular. It's very easy to see if it's not perfect. You quilt a couple swirls, who's to say that's not perfect? But you quilt some crosshatch lines that aren't even, everybody could see. It's funny, one time a guild called and asked me to come to a class on curved crosshatching, and I thought, oh, that would be horrible. So I talked him into swirls instead. But here, doing little bits, right? So just little bits of crosshatch. When I get to where it was getting a little overwhelming, I would just switch to my swirls. So definitely using a design, mixing it with something else so that I don't get overwhelmed or too bored. Let's be honest. I'm easily bored, as we know. And then here we can see more of those swirls with the crosshatch in between. So loved that quilt, loved the texture of it. Every once in a while I'll quilt a quilt for somebody and I'll think, oh, I wonder what will happen if I just don't give this back. But then I do. I don't ever keep their quilts, but sometimes I think about it. All right, this one is a more recent quilt, and I think this is the last one we have to look at today. This is my first ever English paper pieced quilt. So we'll see this in an upcoming episode of the Midnight Quilter. English paper piecing is so opposite of machine quilting, completely opposite. But I have found over the last year that I really like it. I mean, not like as much as machine quilting, don't get me wrong, but I worked on this project, and don't be impressed, it's like this big. And I had a great friend, Irene, helped me figure out how to do it. She even helped me get the pieces together, and then I quilted it. So again, just trying new things and seeing what works and what didn't. If I had made a couple of those wedges and thought, oh yeah, I don't like this anymore, then it would have went with the rest of my projects that never get finished. But this one did, and I'm super excited about it. It's gonna hang in my office. So this is a Twist in Time quilt kit pattern thing featuring Allison Glass's handiwork fabric. And the Twist in Time templates are really awesome. I can't wait to show you in the Midnight Quilter. They're by the Quilting Patch, and they are clear plastic templates, so you can see through and do some fun fussy cutting. But you know, I love the machine quilting. No matter what other things I try, I always come back to my first love. And so I had a lot of fun playing in the negative space of this quilt, kind of connecting those points, drawing the quilting outside of that piecing, and then playing with different colors of thread. It's so much easier to have fun when the quilt is small, so that I'm not committing to doing it over a whole quilt. Definitely a lot more fun on the smaller scale. And I think I have one more picture, and you can see it there. So, you know, it's kind of funny to think from that very first 9-patch quilt to quilting big panels to spaceships, now to little bitty English paper piece projects. I think it's fun that we can do so many different things within the quilting world and really have fun with it. So I am going to real quick switch back to the web camera, and I'm going to just pop on over real quick, see if there's any questions. I'm sure there are. It's really hard to go through this. Oh, okay. Winky, great question. Did I use a template or draw lines for the cross hatching, or did I just wing it? It depends what answer you want to hear. I definitely didn't mark it, and I did just wing it, but not like in the sense like hope this works out. Rulers have reference lines, and so I used the reference lines on the ruler to help space them out. And I also kept them about a half inch apart. I knew that if they were much bigger than that, the difference might be more noticeable when I messed up. And if you look really close, if you go back and look really close, you'll see, you know, some of those areas that aren't perfect. But ultimately, if it's kind of close, it looks fine. There was a question. It was English paper piece. So the last quilt was actually English paper piecing. It's not foundation paper piecing. And what's the best kind of batting to show off the details of dense quilting? I love poly batting. Some of those quilts, like the drawn quilt, and I should have mentioned this, that one with the thread, 2 different threads, that was actually 2 layers of Quilter's Dream wool batting. So multiple layers of batting can really make the quilting show up. And I'm sorry I didn't specify this. All of Tula's quilts, with the exception of the first one, the cartwheel one, have all been quilted with 2 layers of batting. So with her quilts, I always use 2 layers of the Quilter's Dream poly. So why is that? It really gives the quilting such beautiful definition, and the quilting really shows up, and it helps it lay really flat. But it makes it very heavy. So if you're going to hang it on a wall, that's great. Or if you do a lot of trunk shows, like, you know, her and I have done in the past, it's going to make it hang nice and flat. But if you're going to sleep under it, not so much comfort there. So 2 layers of batting is going to help. Thinner batting will give it less definition. I remember one time I did this whole quilt. It was a whole cloth quilt with Quilter's Dream Orient, which is a luscious batting. It's like a bamboo silk blend. The drape is gorgeous, but the quilting doesn't really show. There's not a lot of definition there. So if you want the definition to show up, using poly or a puffier batting will help, or even 2 layers. But that is more for art quilts as well. So definitely there. Why don't people just use blankets instead of batting? I do know some people that do. So I have heard of people putting like pieces of fleece in between their quilts. That could be a good option. And I think that might come from people want the quilts to be not so warm. But using a thinner batting, like, you know, thin cotton, will really keep it from being too warm. Yeah, but the cross hatching looks perfectly imperfect. Yep, it's, you know, if it's consistent. If it's consistently wrong, then it's consistent, right? So it's totally fine. And, you know, the question is, you know, when you're quilting, how do you not get lost? Well, the more you do it, the easier it gets. It's kind of like driving, right? If I always drive somewhere, eventually I figure out how not to get lost. But you have to be good at getting yourself unstuck. So if you find yourself getting stuck, whether it's quilting or piecing or whatever, figure out how to get out of that. And whether it's breaking thread or just backtracking, whatever it takes, just get out there and keep going. Good question, I should have said this. When doing the cross-hatching and the swirls, which did I do first? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, cross-hatching is fills a defined area. So if you're looking at designs, is one design, does it need boundaries or edges? Well, cross-hatching does, because that's how I travel to get to the next one. So that's going to go in second. So the swirls kind of go in first. I'd make like a swirl chunk and leave myself almost like a C, or a defined area on 3 sides and a way to get out. And then I would get in there and then fill in the crosshatch and then come out. Same for like wishbones. If you see wishbones in swirls, swirls don't need a defined area. They can go wherever they want. Wishbones do fill a defined area, so that the wild design goes in first and the defined area goes in, defined design goes in second. If that doesn't make sense, maybe this would be a great topic for a future live chat. And I can get my board out and draw it for you, because it's really cool to see how effortless it is once you know the path. So, all right, so great question. So when I was on before we went live, I always get on here about half an hour before and answer chat. We kind of chat on the video. So really fun, great opportunity if you want to get on there and ask a question. But there were some good questions, and Nancy asked, she said she can't seem to get past the meandering and the straight and curvy lines. Like, she wants to do more stuff, but just can't seem to make that leap. Well, and she asked my advice. The best advice for that is, if you're comfortable with something and you want to learn something else, don't just jump in, right? Don't just jump in the deep end, transition into that. Okay, so what do I mean by that? If I'm doing a meander, let's say I am the meandering queen of Missouri, got my crown and everything. I'm going to do my meander, but every once in a while, maybe I throw in a little loop, or maybe 2 loops, and then go back to my meandering, right? So do what feels comfortable, but every once in a while, just add something different. And then maybe soon I start adding more loops. And then I'm like, oh, okay, now I can do the loopy meander. Well, now maybe I'm like, ooh, I'm going to add a leaf every once in a while, just a little shape, and then go back to something else. Don't feel like you have to say, okay, now I'm going to say, not going to do this and I'm going to do that. You can use them both. And it's the same advice I give to people that do pantographs, or even have like the computerized component, like the Pro Stitcher for the handy quilter. If you feel comfortable with pantographs, which is where you're kind of tracing along a design, quilt out your row, but leave a space in between the next row and add a little bit of quilting in between it, right? So use what you already feel comfortable doing to tiptoe into something new. And then also look at it like a game. I always try to think like, ooh, what can I do different? What's something I haven't done before? Almost like a challenge, less like a scary thing. So that's the best advice I have. I hope that helps. I know that it can be a little scary trying something new, but I don't mind looking stupid, so I usually don't have too much trouble with it. What's the best color of thread to use when quilting tulip pink fabrics and to keep from too many thread changes? Well, here's the great thing about busy fabrics. You really can't see the quilting anyway. So aim for a neutral colored thread in the value of the quilt. So for Tula, usually I can get away with like a medium tan or like a light yellow or something like that. Except if we're like talking about extreme color changes. You'll see a quilt that I'm working on for her right now that has so many thread changes, but you know, sometimes you have to do it. That's what's best for the quilt. Okay, so thank you for joining me for this chat. I want to show you, we have weekly giveaways, or I do. And so this week's giveaway is going to be my Quilting is My Therapy coffee table book. And a lot of the quilts that I showed today are in this book. Now this isn't like a how to quilt it type of book, but it's more like an inspiration where I show really up close pictures of quilting. A lot of Tula's quilts are in here, but I also talk a little bit about my journey, about how I became a long arm quilter, even though I had failed the home ec sewing machine test twice in 8th grade. So you can, to enter the giveaway, you're going to click on the link in the description box of the video. So when this video is over, this chat is over, you'll go to the description box, there's a link, and you'll just enter your email, and I'll announce the winner next week. So, and speaking of next week we'll be back with another live chat, and I'm going to be giving you tips for machine quilting feathers. So I love quilting feathers. You've seen just a few in this little trunk show. And so I'll give you some tips, like things that really helped it click for me. Now, I have really been enjoying doing these live chats. So if you have suggestions on what you want to see on future chats, definitely put them in the comment box below. I've kind of lined up the next 4 4 weeks worth. You can find those on my website, Quilting is My Therapy, or in the description box below. But I'm definitely open to new topics and ideas. It's so much easier if you guys help me figure it out than to make me figure it out on my own. So thank you so much for joining me for this virtual trunk show. I hope you've enjoyed it. And again, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment box below. And I will see you next week. So until then, stay safe, you all, and happy quilting. Bye.